hopefully I can be of help. So by way of discussion, or what we've been doing for the past 6 or 8 weeks now, we started by looking at the basic understanding of what a macroeconomic model is. Basically, is mostly an aggregate setup, trying to understand how decisions do affect the economy as a whole. And we did make mention of the fact that indeed, even though it's a macro setup, we mostly needed a micro foundation to better understand what's going on. And this was the Lucas critique, as we pointed out earlier. So by way of the first chapter, or the first 2 chapters, there were 2 important things that came up. We realized that within any macro setting, we have what we call a short run model, or short run, and we have a long run. So short run, basically within the period of 1 or 2 years. Long run within a very larger time span, be it 5 or 10 years or whatever. So we started by looking at the long run model. Under the long run model, if I remember, which was basically the first part of our discussion, we looked at whether it's a Malthusian in terms of the model's explanation as to what happened in the very olden days. We had only land and labor, and that was it. And it tells us we tend to understand what's going on in terms of that setting. Then we also look at the solo growth model. We look at the endogenous growth model and the rest. And one thing that came up under the long run model was the fact that most macroeconomists do agree with each other when they talk about long run growth. So their understanding of economic growth was fairly standard, and they had no disagreement between each other. So that was a long run setup, and that was what we did. So that was first part of the first 6 weeks. And then we went ahead to understand the search model. Within the search model, the whole idea was, how do people look for work and all that. So if you quite remember, we had a one-sided search model, we had a two-sided search model, and the rest, which was part of our first midterm as well. Then lastly, I believe we spoke about the micro foundation in terms of one period model, and that was also heavily related to this setting. So if you take 1, 2, and 3, this happens to be the first setup of our course. And again, as I pointed out, because of the participation, most of you happen to be in class, this will not be repeated for your finals. So 1, 2, 3 will not be repeated. Now, this is where maybe if you're not very careful, you might find it confusing. So just make sure you stop me if it's not clear. Having realized that the long run model is not really confusing in the sense that they all agree with each other and they had standard models to better understand what's going on, the difficulty might be coming from the short run model, wherein we have the business cycle. Within a short run, there might be some fluctuations that might come in, and macroeconomists might have different ways of solving such problems. So it's very important that we understand this important detail. Where do we have the difficulty? How do they propose that we resolve this difficulty? So that's the whole idea behind the short run model. So this is very technical, this is very difficult, and this is a bit unsettling. So there's a need for us to better understand the short run model. But before we go to the short run model, we have to basically have the Lucas critique in mind. Find a setup, a micro setup, to better explain the short run model. So before we went to the short run model, we started by looking at the 2-period model, where we assume that somebody lives for 2 periods. He says for today against tomorrow, and he makes his decision based on the interest rate, how patient he is, and all that. So we started by looking at a very simple short run model where they had endowments. Then we extended the short run model to a raw intertemporal model, wherein it's mostly the same thing, but instead of having a usual endowment, we assume that they work to get their endowment or to get their income. So that was just an extension of what we started. And again, we also made an assumption as to whether the income effect will outweigh the substitution effect or vice versa. So this was an important assumption that we kept on changing as we moved along. Then lastly, we moved from the real intertemporal model with investments as well to further capture the effect of money. So within this same setup, we introduced in money to better understand how the economy will behave in the presence of money, which is more realistic compared to this and that. So with 1, 2, 3, we now have a refined model that can help us understand the short-run model proper. So with this advanced setup, we are ready to tackle the short-run model or the short-run business cycle. Before we start with the business cycle, there's a need for us to know a couple of things. How does the business cycle look like? Is it the same as a long-run growth model? How different is it from the long-run growth model? So that's what we did on Thursday, I believe, or Tuesday, I believe, wherein we looked at the movement between these macroeconomic models in the short run, such that we identify a couple of factors, given the empirical data that Alex asked about. If GDP is increasing, what do we expect employment to do? If GDP is increasing, what do we expect consumption to do? So we had important terminologies like procyclical, countercyclical, acyclical, leading variable, lagging variable, and coincidence. So these are things that we identify under the short-run dynamics. How do they behave with GDP, and how do we better understand it? So we spend much time, I believe, on Thursday to better understand that. So that was the features under the short-run model. Procyclical, countercyclical, acyclical. Is it a leading variable? Is it a lagging variable? And is it a coincidence? Then, as we pointed out earlier, within the short-run model, there are a couple of key things that we need to understand in terms of the differences that the macroeconomists have. In terms of the intervention, for instance, some of them do believe that there is a particular intervention that works better than the other, and others believe otherwise. So we'll be looking at it very shortly, probably on Thursday. Then we also have to look at the neutrality of money. How important is money in our model? Is it that money is nominal, or is it that money can really play an important role? So on Thursday, I believe we looked at the fact that money can be presumed to be neutral, in the sense that with an increase in money, we don't expect any real variable to change. And that was the neutrality of money. And that's what we saw under the monetary model of exchange rates, as monetary model of intertemporal model. So this is a neutrality part of it. Again, when we talk about the differences, there might be an instance where money is no more considered to be neutral, and I'll look at that probably on Thursday. So these are things that you need to understand as we go along. So have a look at this. If there's anything that you miss, please let me know. If anyone has any question in there, please let me know. So this will be the major part of our second discussion. We start from everything on this side is where you need to concentrate. Make sure you understand every nitty-gritty of this as we move towards the second part of the course. Osama, is there anyone with any question in there?
So far, no.
Okay, so if you happen to be around, just type your full name and type present, and we go along and see how to start today's discussion. So I'm going to start with the business cycle. The intuition here is to use the advanced version of our model where we have money to see how consistent our model can help predict the business cycle. So just a reminder, just get the fact that we saw under the chapter 3, where we saw a couple of factors. Please keep that one in mind as we go along. We had something that we call procyclical. This was under chapter 3. We had countercyclical. And we had acyclical. We had leading variable. We had lagging variable. We had coincidence. So these are the factors that we saw in chapter 3. And an important indication here is get to know what we made mention in terms of maybe employment and GDP and the rest. So what we are going to do here is the main idea under chapter 13, starting with, is to use the model to match the empirical data results in chapter 3. We now have our model. We want to use our model to see how consistent our model is with the intertemporal results that we saw in chapter 3. Is there anyone with any question? So let's start with trying to match the business cycle results in chapter 3. What do we understand by business cycle? There are a couple of factors that will come in for you to understand how a business cycle, occurs. One important detail behind these changes as we find ourselves in a short time period is what we call a shock. Ideally, everyone expects the economy to move towards this direction. If you are increasing, and if this is time and this is your GDP, if you are increasing, you increase forever. If you are increasing, you increase forever. This is what everybody, expects in the ideal situation. But as we know, in the real world, we don't expect things to be perfect. An example is the COVID situation. If this happens to be our predicted growth over time, because of the COVID-19, we might be moving towards, so let's take this guy to be 2019. We might be on the track of having what we expect to have, but because of COVID-19, which is a shock to us because we didn't expect it, our GDP might move downwards. Then it will start picking up again, and maybe in 2025, somebody might introduce a very a nice technology which will move our GDP higher than what we expected. And it will keep on going in that direction. So what we should understand by a shock is that there might be events that will bring our GDP down within the short run, and there might be events that will bring our GDP up within the short run. And this is what we saw in chapter 3. So to better understand this shock, you might want to model it in a way that might be convenient to you. Maybe take your GDP to be this guy, Z, F, K, N. This is how you produce. And a shock might happen on your Z. For the case of the COVID situation, the Z will come down. And as the Z comes down, your Y comes down. This is an example of a shock. So when a shock happens, we expect our Z to come down. When the shock is positive, we expect the Z to go up. So a shock might come to us in a positive way, it might come to us in a negative way. When it comes to us in a negative way, we consider it as a reduction in our GDP. When it comes to us in a positive way, maybe someone has developed a new technology, then we consider it to be a positive development. So our GDP is going to come up. So this is what we understand by shock, and this is how shock moves us away from our long-term predicted growth as we go along. So we have the shock here. We understand where the shock is coming from. Let's put it on the Z to make things much easier. And the GDP will be coming down or up in the short-run model as we predicted. Is there anyone with any question in there?
No.
Okay. One thing about shock is persistence, and this is going to be very important. So please keep this idea in mind. Persistence. If a shock happens today, so persistence means that if a shock happens, how long does it take to go away? So this might be today, this might be tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow. So when a shock happens, we expect Z to change. But what persistence tells us is that tomorrow's shock will follow today's shock. An example is the COVID situation. Because of the COVID-19, in 2019, GDP might be low. In 2020, we expect the effect of the COVID to still be around. So we still expect the shock to persist for some time. So if the shock is up today, we expect it to be up tomorrow as well, but not as high as today. The day after tomorrow, maybe T plus 2, it will still be up, but not as high as this. T plus 3, then it will go back to normal. So this is what you need to understand, the persistence. It will be high today. When the shock hits us today, it will be high. It will have a high impact on us. Tomorrow, the impact will still be around, but not as compared to today. The day after tomorrow, the impact will still be around, but not as that of what we saw in T plus 1. And maybe in T plus 3, the shock will automatically vanish. We come back to where we find ourselves. So this is what we need to understand by persistence. So keep this one in mind, because the analysis I'm about doing, we need persistence to better understand what's going on. And if anyone has any question, please draw my attention. Questions in there? Osama?
No, so far.
Good. So let's see how our model can help predict what we see in the short run. Is it consistent with the short run, or is it not? So we start by looking at a positive shock that has occurred in our model. So let me quickly.
We have a question.
Sure, feel free, guys.
What is the difference between persistence, temporary and permanent?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for instance, COVID-19, right? COVID-19, when it happens, we know it's something that obviously we might develop a vaccine, and we will use the vaccine to cure ourselves, and we go back to where we were maybe in 2018, right? So this is a temporal effect. But if, for instance, we expect to live with COVID-19 for the rest of our lives with no vaccine, then it's a permanent effect. It's not going to go away. It's not going to vanish. So that's the difference between something that is temporal, in that it will vanish after some time, and we have something that is permanent, in that it will be there forever. Is that okay?
Yes, sounds good, I guess. We have another question. So
Sure.
both temporary and permanent shock have persistence to different degrees.
Yeah,
temporary.
exactly. The rates at they have maybe the temporal and permanent shock, they might have the same magnitude as of the time that they hit, but temporal vanishes after T plus 1 or after T, whilst permanent will still be there regardless. So they have one similarity, which is at the point where they both hit, they all have the same magnitude. However, after T plus 1, the magnitude tends to differ. Is that okay?
Yeah, I guess that would.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's see how our model will help us predict the business cycle effect that we saw in chapter 3. Start by looking at a shock, that is a positive shock. Positive shock. So I'm going to draw the graphs that we saw in, I believe, chapter 12, which is our intertemporal model with money. So we had the money market, we had the labor market first. Where we had this guy here. We had this guy here, labor supply, labor demand. Let's call this guy labor demand 1. Let's call this guy labor supply. But remember, labor supply is a function of interest rate, which is very important as we go along. Then we come to the goods market. So remember how we derive the goods market from the demand side, which is basically coming from the interest rate playing a role, and from the supply side, which is also a function of interest rates. And we have the equilibrium level of output somewhere here, which is Y1. So let's label this guy as Y1. So I have YD1, YS1. Then lastly, because we introduced in money in chapter 12, we had the money market. And remember, the money market was a function of output, interest rates, and prices. So we had the money demand. Remember, money demand came from the fact that we demand money based on our output and interest rates. We had the supply of money, which we assumed to be pretty much fixed for now. That is to say, it is exogenous. It's not determined in the model. So we have prices here, we had money here, and then we have the equilibrium level of prices somewhere here. So this is going to be key as we start. So this is the model that we saw in chapter 12. If you have questions, please let me know. Let me quickly check this guy up. Someone is trying to get to me. Okay. Is there anyone with any question? So this is what we saw in chapter.
Not so far.
No questions, or there are questions?
No, there are no questions.
Good. So let's start by looking at the shock. The shock we have here is an increase in Z. So I'm going to use this side to explain the increase in Z.
We have a question.
Sure, feel free.
Money demand includes credit card demand or not?
Remember, your transactions are basically coming from credit card and money demand, right? So the two do determine the amount of money demand. So as we pointed out, if I know the outputs and I know the money demand coming from currency, which is cash, then I automatically know the money coming from credit card. So if I know Y and I know MD, then I automatically know what's coming from credit card. But for now, credit card is not going to be here, but inherently, we know that credit card also plays a role. Is that okay? Remember the equation. To simplify the equation, this is the entire output. The transaction that we need to make is coming from money demand, and it's also coming from credit card. So if in this equation, I know Y and I know this, then I automatically know what the credit market is also looking like. But within this setup, you might not see it, but it is hidden somewhere in there. Is that okay?
Yeah, that is okay.
So I'll start by looking at the effect, which is increase in Z. Osama, can you guys see from there?
Yeah, I can see perfectly.
Okay, so increase in Z. The first effect from the increase in Z is that when Z increases today, due to persistence, we expect Z for period 2, which is Z prime, to also go up. So this is very important. It might be the case that I'll only say that Z has increased and I'll be silent. But you have to use the idea of persistence to predict that Z for tomorrow is going to increase as well, so that you have two effects playing a role. If not, then you find yourself in trouble. If you only look at Z for today without looking for Z for tomorrow increasing, I'm afraid you might just end up with half of the analysis and it will be half of the mark. So please keep in mind how persistence play a role here. If that's fine, then I can go ahead and see what's going on. So with an increase in Z, a couple of things do happen. Number one, we saw persistence, which is the first one, which means Z for tomorrow is going to increase. Is it safe to say the marginal product of labor?
Question.
Questions,
How
Osama?
how can we know whether the shock has a persistence or not?
Oh, as I pointed out, right, in macroeconomics, we all assume that the shock is persistent, right? Unless, of course, I state otherwise. But for now, just like the case of the assumptions that we made behind the income effect and expenditure effect outweighing each other, the same assumption holds here. So for now, for this chapter and for this course, the standard assumption is that it is persistent. Unless I come in and say, hey, it's not persistent, it's just a one time and off it goes. Then you can just go ahead and do one-sided analysis. Is that okay? Unless I state otherwise, you have to assume that it's persistent. Yeah.
Yeah, that is okay. Yeah.
So when Z increases, when Z for today increases, what we saw in assignment 2 and what we saw in the midterm was that as Z increases, the marginal product of labor increases, which implies that the demand for workers increases. This is the first part. If anyone has an issue with that, please let me know. So this is what we saw in your assignment. As Z increases, what we expect to see, the demand for workers increase. Is that okay?
Yes, that is okay.
Good. Now, you might want to come here and then draw it, but let's keep it somewhere so that when we finish, we do a complete analysis of most of the styles that we saw. 3. With an increase in Z, what happens to the output supply? With an increase in Z, what happens to output supply? Remember, output, we produce output by looking at this guy here. So with an increase in Z, what happens to the output that we supply? Questions? Is there anyone to help me? With an increase in Z, what happens to output supply?
It increases. Everyone's saying it increases or it's up.
Yeah. So output supply increases. So as Z increases, Z for today increases, output supply increases. Z for today increases, marginal product of labor increases. So please keep in mind, make sure you differentiate between Z bar or Z prime and Z. So here I'm just looking at the Z's as we work along. So when Z increases, the supply also increases. This is more or less like a direct effect. direct impact. It just impacts it directly, and we see a positive effect. Now, the second aspect of it is key. Remember, within the same supply equation, how they produce their output. It comes from the fact that I have Z here, I have F here, I have N here, I have K here. The question here is, with an increase in demand, what happens to output supply? Remember, there is an increase in demand here. What happens to output supply? Anyone to help me? Anyone to help me? It increases, right? So we have increase in output supply as well. So there is more or less two effects. There is a direct impact that we saw from Z, and there is more or less an indirect impact that came from the labor market. As the labor demand increases, output is produced using labor, and this guy also increases. 4. Please stop me if something is not clear. Please stop me if something is not clear. Is there anyone with any question in there?
No, not right now.
Okay. Let's try and see the persistence, where the persistence plays a role. So remember, this is Z for today. This is Z for today. Now let's see where the persistence will come in. And persistence implies that as Z for today increases, then Z for tomorrow also increases. So this is going to be very key. Persistence implies that as Z for today increases, Z for tomorrow also increases. Question: when people expect Z for tomorrow to increase, what do you think that they will do? When a firm expects tomorrow everything is going to be very good, for every capital that I have a higher output. Exactly. They will invest more because they expect tomorrow to be good. They expect the output to increase for every investment that they make. So when they expect tomorrow to go up, the marginal product of capital for tomorrow is expected to increase as well. And if that's the case, they will increase their investment in capital, or they will increase their capital level. So K will go up or I will go up. This is the first part. Now the question here is, why didn't we see an increase in investment or an increase in capital level under just Z? This is very important for extra points. Why didn't we see an increase in the capital level? You want to read it, Osama?
Investment only relies on future marginal product of capital.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a very good point. Investment only relies on tomorrow. So today, I'm already in today. There's no way I can make any investment. I only have to just say, hey, today is gone. I will just look at tomorrow and invest towards what I expect tomorrow to be. That's why we don't see it here. So that's a very good point. Who made that point, Osama?
Jean made the point.
John, thank you. Yeah, that's a very good point. So please keep that one in mind as we go along. When Z is expected to go up, investment goes up. What do we think people expect their income to be? Tomorrow, we expect Z to be up because today Z is up. What do we think that people's expectation of the income is going to be? It's higher, right? So they expect tomorrow's income to be higher. If they expect tomorrow's income to be higher, what happens to their consumption? We use a very simple theory, exactly, which will be higher. Because of what theory? Sorry, guys. Because of what theory? What theory comes to mind? Exactly, consumption smoothing. Because of consumption smoothing, their consumption is also going to go high. So we have a situation where individuals are increasing their consumption today, even though the expectation is for tomorrow, and that's only possible because of consumption smoothing. So their consumption today is going to go up. Their capital level for tomorrow is going to go up, which basically implies their investment is going to go up. So we have C increasing, we have I increasing. Any further points to note? If you have any further points, please let me know. Questions as well?
No, so far.
Okay. What happens to output demanded then for today? People are increasing their consumption. People are increasing their investment. What happens to output demand? Remember, output demand is a function of C, I, G, and net export. If C is going up, I is going up, what happens to output demand then? Anyone to help us? It's going to go up, correct. So output demand is also going to go up. And you can only see this when you use the persistence side of the argument. If you don't use the persistence, then it becomes very difficult for you to see what's going on. If you have questions, please let me know. My board is not big enough to accommodate the extra analysis that I need to make. I need to go to, I believe, the interest rate side of it, and also go to the money market and all that. So let's see. So we have a situation where supply is going up, demand is also going up. And this is where Alex's question during the first part of our course is going to be very helpful. Let's have a look at what I'm talking about. We have a situation where demand is increasing. So I have demand increasing. At the same time, I have supply to increase. Supply might increase, and it might also go towards this direction, maybe somewhere here. And then the interest rate might be at the same level that we expect it to be. So we have a level of ambiguity here. Demand is increasing, supply is increasing, interest rate might be at the same point where we met it. So this might be interest rate at the point of 1, and this might be the same interest rate at the point of 1. So we might not necessarily see what's happening to interest rate. But if you go back to what Alex pointed out in the first part of our course, where he said, when you have a more direct effect, you are more willing to say that it has a higher impact compared to the one that is indirect. So where did we see the more direct effect? We saw the direct effect on the supply side of it, because as Z goes up, this guy goes up. So there's a more direct impact on your Y. So you are more confident to say that the supply will increase more than the demand. And if that's the case, then I can claim this line, increase the demand, but not as much as the supply. So put it somewhere here. And I can clearly see what's happening to the interest rate. Interest rate goes down. If you have questions, please let me know. Please stop me here. If you have questions, let me know. I'm going to be waiting for questions if it's not clear and all
that. We have a question. Which impact was more direct? Can you repeat that one more time?
The impact that I believe is more direct is on the supply, because remember, the entire analysis started from an increase in Z. And we can only see Z directly affecting labor supply from this Cobb-Douglas equation, where this is Z, this is K, this is N. So when this guy here, which is Z, is up, I'm more confident to see that the impact here will increase the supply higher, right? Osama, questions?
Alex says, so future Z increases less than Z, the present Z that does?
What's that? Sorry?
the future Z increases more than the present Z?
No, because of persistence, and because of the fact that persistence decreases with time, the current Z has a higher magnitude compared to the future Z. Remember, persistence implies that as the shock comes in, it automatically dies off. So Alex, this is persistence. This is my T, this is my Z. At the initial point where it hits, it's going to be very high, but it will die off automatically. So current Z is higher than future Z due to persistence. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
So given that we can make that claim that the Y supply is higher than the Y demand, then we have the interest rates to fall. If you happen to be around, type your full name and type present for the second roll call before we finish for today's discussion. Okay, so we now know what happens to our interest rate. We know what happens to our demand. So we are more confident to tackle what happens to our money markets now.
We have a question.
Sure, feel free.
So in an exam, should we assume that the direct effect is larger, or should we just say that it's ambiguous?
It depends. So I might come in and make a point, or I might just keep it ambiguous. So if you look at your midterms on the COVID, and I believe your quiz on the COVID, it was ambiguous, and most of you were like ambiguous, and there was a side that was clear, and most of you were clear as well. So I might come in and point it out. Is that okay?
Yeah, I guess.
Okay. Good. So we have a situation where R.
We have another question. So it says that it would depend on the question, the previous question I asked.
Yeah. Yeah. So okay. Question?
Yeah, no questions.
So we have a situation where the demand is up and the interest rate is down. And we know money demand equation depends on MD equals P as a function of Y as a function of R. So we can clearly see what happens to the demand. So demand for money is also going to go up because of these two impacts. So we know what's happening to the demand market. So demand is going to increase. The money demand is going to increase. So you can use the this guy here to show the increase in money demand. And again, because interest rate is down, the further effect here is because the interest rate is down and Y demand is a function of C as a function of R, as a function of R, etc. Whenever interest rate comes down, investment increases, consumption increases, Y increases. So we have YD also coming up, which is a further effect on the interest rate coming down. So one, as the interest rate comes down, money demand goes up. Two, as the interest rate comes down, YD also goes up. And lastly, as the interest rate goes down, we know because of income effect and substitution effect, and the fact that we already made an assumption that the substitution effect is higher than the income effect, we can clearly see that the labor supply is going to go down because there is less interest rate. So here, the same argument, the demand for labor will go up from the firms, the supply for labor will come down because of the decrease in interest rate. So we end up with a much higher N, which is N2. This was our initial N1. So employment is up, wage is up, output is up, interest rate is down, money demand is up. The question here is this consistent with chapter 3? And I can say yes. In chapter 3, we saw the following facts from the empirical data. We saw that consumption is up whenever GDP goes up. And that's what we saw here, consistent.
We have a question.
Sure.
So assuming that the positive influence of Z on labor demand is greater than the negative effect of R on NS.
Exactly. Yeah. Because again, if it's not the case, it's going to be ambiguous. Yeah. Right? Further questions?
No questions.
So in chapter 3, we saw that whenever GDP goes up due to a shock or due to any short run or business cycle effects, consumption goes up. Is this consistent with our model? Yes, it is. Whenever the shock happens, we saw that consumption goes up. Number 2, investment is up whenever GDP is up. It's the same thing as what we just saw here. At the end of the day, Z goes up, interest rate is down. As interest rate comes down, I goes up. Consistent. Number 3, employment is up whenever GDP is up. Consistent, because Z goes up, GDP is up, the amount of labor supply or the amount of workers also increases. This is consistent with what we saw in chapter 3. So our model is doing a very good job in trying to match the data that we saw in chapter 3. And lastly, the labor productivity, procyclical, the same thing. So these are a couple of things that you have to keep in mind as you look at the early part of chapter 13. What I just finished doing is to link chapter 3 to chapter 13. Chapter 3 was just data, whilst chapter...
we have a question.
Yeah.
Is price acyclical?
Price might be acyclical, correct? If the central bank comes in to stabilize the price, it will be acyclical, consistent. Yeah. What he's saying here is, if you look at this price, at the end of the day, if the central bank maintains the same money supply, this guy just comes here to P2. So price drops. So when GDP goes up, price goes down. But acyclical price means that if the central bank now comes in to stabilize the price, it might want to increase money supply to MS2, and as it increases money supply, price comes back to normal.
But
so
Alex says that here it shows that price is counter-cyclical.
Counter-cycle. Okay. In that case, it's consistent, right? Because as GDP goes up, prices go down. P2. If the central bank doesn't come in, which means this line is no more there. But if you use the central...
Yeah, so in chapter 3, the price is acyclical, and here it isn't matching with the model result.
Yeah, it doesn't. If only you keep the central bank fixed. If the central bank is not coming in to stabilize the prices, then we don't have anything to say. But if the central bank is coming in to stabilize the prices, then we have something to say. John,
we have another question. It says that in this case, it would be counter-cyclical because money supply isn't changing.
Yeah, it will be counter-cyclical if money supply is not changing. Because as GDP goes up, due to increase in Z, we saw that the prices go down, which is counter. Counter means they are negatively related. If they are pro-cyclical, then when one increases, the other increases. Questions?
But I think it's fine. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so if you have questions, let me know. Yeah.
There's another question. It says that, can you explain again why increase in labor demand is larger than the decrease in labor supply?
Yeah, so that was a good question. So first thing first, you might want to point out the fact that the reduction in interest rates might lead to two things. It might lead to income effect and substitution effect. So if income effect and substitution effects are trying to cancel each other out, the actual effect on labor supply is a bit muted. But because we've already taken a stand to say that the substitution effect is higher, we might come up with an increase with a reduction in labor supply. However, for the demand side of labor, we don't have any confusion over there. Labor demand is just going to increase from the firm side. And again, as the firm experiences a direct effect, they will increase their demand the more. So we can confidently say that the demand for labor is higher than the supply of labor. Right?
We have another question. It says, which chapters will be on the quiz? Everything after the midterm?
I guess we pointed out earlier. Anyone remembers what we said? Within, if someone is in there and he or she remembers what we said, help me with it. I think I made the announcement 2 or 3 times. Okay.
Chapter 9 to 11. Chapter 9 and 11.
Okay, sure. So just keep an eye on the announcement that we make so that we wouldn't be repeating each time, right? Because I want to be consistent and I wouldn't want to repeat something that I forgot. So just keep the announcements in mind. Further questions, guys? If this might be tricky, just keep an eye on it. Questions?
No, I don't see any.
Oh, okay. Okay, so if there are no questions, hopefully I'll see you guys on Thursday where we, okay.
Do we cover chapter 3? That's a question.
All right. What Tanya said was what we agreed on. Right? What Tanya just pointed out is what we agreed on. Tanya, do you want to repeat it again? What we agreed on for the quiz. Okay. So what was the question, Osama, from the other student?
It was that is chapter 3 included? Like, I don't know if it's about the quiz or about this chapter. So he just said, is chapter 3 included? Yeah, on the quiz, he's asking if chapter 3 is on the quiz. Okay, then. I think it's been answered by Tanya. Yeah. If you have further questions, let me know. We still have 2 minutes or 3. Okay. Okay, then if there are no questions, hopefully I'll see you guys on Thursday for the quiz. Just make sure you come prepared with your pens and pencils and papers and all that. Okay, see you guys. Bye-bye. Bye.